Sadly, it didn't work out. Brian was too fragile to pull the project off. His drug taking had gotten out of control, and he began to become certifiably insane in response to the pressure he put on himself. He also was becoming an insufferable perfectionist, and he couldn't decide what he really wanted to do. Eventually, he had another nervous breakdown, and the project was shelved. In turn, he went into self-imposed exile, a deep state of depression that lasted for basically a decade, where he stayed in bed all day, did drugs, and ate himself into oblivion, till he was a fat blob. The creative genius that once was a workaholic became lazy and disinterested, and he was basically a vegetable for a long time. The boys who mostly relied on Brian were forced to either quit or pick up the pieces. Carl emerged as a leader, and he saved the band, but the band fell into obscurity. The band was left with nothing but pieces of unfinished work for Smile, and the boys basically just dug the pieces out and made Smiley smile instead. The result was mediocre at best and plain ugly at worst. It did feature an absolute classic in Good Vibrations, which was Brian's last creative surge before the breakdown. It became a huge hit, but sadly he was spent after it. Smiley Smile has its defenders, including some who think it's one of the band's best albums, or that it was an eccentric, underrated gem. But to me, it's an incoherent mess. Carl once said that it was like getting a bunt instead of a home run. I think he's too easy on it. To me, it's just a plain strikeout. To me, Smiley Smile is an interesting but weird mess. It features, in my mind, 3 great songs and a bunch of ugly noise that would have turned out great if Brian had actually knew what to do with it. The 70s were a hard time for the boys. They had left surf rock well behind them, but didn't know what else to do without Brian leading them. The band went from one of the vanguards of rock to a has-been group that were considered old-fashioned and washed up. None of the records they made in the 70s were well received at the time, but these days there's a lot of people who actually prefer these albums to the more simple stuff they put out in the beginning. Sadly, none of it sold. There was plenty of stinkers in this time, but there was also some gems too, particularly Surf's Up, Love You, Sunflower, and my personal favorite, Friends, which is the best album they ever made not called Pet Sounds. Mostly because this was one of the few albums where Brian came out of his coma and contributed. This album is weird, dopey, short, but gorgeous and catchy all the same. The band put out a greatest hits album, and it was a huge hit, so the band had pressure to bring Brian back. Unfortunately, Brian was a bloated shell of his former great self, and sadly, years of drug use had ruined his once beautiful voice, that now sounded like an Ozzy Osbourne croak. They made what many considered to be a deal with the devil. They reached out to experimental psychiatrist Eugene Landry, who is often considered the Yoko of the band. As for me, I feel like he gets a little screwed in the band's lore. Yes, he did some things that were unethical, and yes, he was very controlling. But at the end of the day, he got Brian off his butt, made him lose the weight, and got him back to writing and contributing again. His methods were unorthodox at best and abusive at worst. But as far as I'm concerned, he saved Brian's life. I'm not saying he gets a bad rap necessarily, but I do think he should get more credit for doing what he was paid to do, even if he outlived his welcome. Landry got Brian back to sanity again, but he also was a slave master who alienated him from the rest of the band. And now Mike was in firm control of the group. He always believed that the band dropped the golden egg when they stopped making pop music, and he put them completely into retro oldies mode, which they rode for decades. Unfortunately, except for one great song called Kokomo, they became a joke again. But finally, Brian was really back. Now in a happy marriage and without Landry's leash, they got together to make one more record called That's Why God Made the Radio. Thankfully, it was a good one. By this time, Dennis and Carl were dead. Every member of the band attempted a solo career, but only Brian and Dennis were successful. Brian's work in particular is really good, and you should definitely check it out. And Brian finally did the Smile album after all these decades, albeit as a solo album without the other guys. They were probably the least consistent great band ever. They had a lot of great and excellent work, but they had a lot of bad albums too. But at the end of the day, Brian Wilson is an absolute genius, and it's a shame we lost him recently. Even Paul McCartney is a huge fan, and no one knows more about music than him. As far as vocal groups go, only the Beatles surpass them. I just want to say one more thing before we close, and it's this. Thanks, Brian Wilson. Thanks for all the great music. God only knows what we would do without you.